First, this hour, a story that made national headlines a few years ago, how an elderly American man ended up in a rural town in the UK, not knowing who he is or where he was from. Yesterday, these questions were answered. A 53-year-old, this is Simon Yates from Taunton, was jailed for 2.5 years for his role in the plot to abandon Roger Curry in Hereford. Our reporter Nicola Goodwin has been following the story since it happened back in 2015.
Yes, morning. This really was an extraordinary case and a mystery that's taken years to get to the bottom of. If we go back to November 2015, West Mercia Police first released details about an American man who they'd been told had been found wandering around Credenhill, but nobody knew who he was. They launched an appeal in the hope that the public might be able to identify him, and this is how we reported it at the time.
Police say they're desperate for the public's help to identify a man found wandering in the Credenhill area of Hereford at the weekend. The West Mercia Force say the man, who has given his name as Roger Curry, is displaying signs that he may have dementia and is saying very little but speaks with either an American or Canadian accent. Investigations are ongoing to try and work out whether he's been reported missing, and you can see a photo and more details on our Facebook page.
Well, 4 months later, the police were no closer to finding out the true identity of Roger Curry. He'd been living at Credenhill Court nursing home since he'd been found, but checks with Interpol, the Missing Persons Bureau, the National Crime Agency and both the American and the Canadian embassies had all drawn a blank. Then in March 2016, West Mercia Police released a recording of Roger talking to one of his carers, hoping that somebody might recognise his voice.
Can you see her?
There was a lot of people right there.
That's right, it was yesterday.
Yeah, they sure did.
There was a lot of people here yesterday.
Yeah, they were down there.
Were they?
I remember seeing them down there. Have you been in that house there?
When it's warmer, we go and sit in there.
Yeah, look at that tall tree up there.
Yeah?
Wow.
Mr. Curry was later found to be from Los Angeles and his birth name was actually Earl. He was cared for in the residential home in Credenhill for 8 months before he was flown back to the United States in July 2016. The court was told that his care had cost the NHS up to £20,000. On the day that Mr. Curry was found, Simon Hayes had taken him to Hereford bus station, which is right next door to the county hospital. There he'd met a nurse and he told her that he'd found the man face down in a country lane and he had no idea who he was. He also lied and told the court that he was in Herefordshire as he was on a Special Forces training course. Of course, that was all a pack of lies. He'd been in regular contact with Mr. Curry's son Kevin via text and phone calls and had been involved in a plan to bring Roger over from the United States and abandon him so that he could be cared for by the NHS. Yesterday, Simon Hayes was sentenced to 2.5 years for perverting the course of public justice and for fraud. Meanwhile, Mr. Curry's son Kevin is also under investigation in the United States for elder abuse, for fraud and for kidnapping.
That's the story reported there by Nicola Goodwin. Now, Rachael Nicholson-Wright is the Director of Action on Elder Abuse. Good morning, Rachael.
Good morning, Claire.
What are your thoughts on this case?
Well, it's a very unusual case, and I think we're very pleased that it's got the attention that it has, but I think that's mainly because of the international element to it. But it's shocking. I mean, we don't see it so much in this country, but it is prevalent in the United States where they actually call it granny dumping, which we find shocking because it really distracts from what we're talking about, which is what happened to Mr. Curry, which is abandonment and neglect of a vulnerable older person.
I mean, your charity raises awareness of elderly abuse. How big a problem is that if we look at that term, sort of broadly speaking?
Well, broadly speaking, what we're looking at is all forms of abuse, so neglect, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse and financial abuse. And we did some polling in 2017, and that revealed that 10% of older people across the UK have experienced some form of abuse. But we know that's the tip of the iceberg because it's so widely underreported. We have a helpline that provides advice and support for older people experiencing abuse and family and friend members who are concerned about someone that might be experiencing abuse. And so often we hear that people don't want to go forward and report it to the police or social services, often because they're fearful of the repercussions.
I mean, that's an interesting point. Why is it, do you think, it's underreported? Do we simply just not know it's happening?
I think there is a lack of awareness, which we're trying to combat in the UK about older people. We don't talk about the abuse of older people as much as we do child abuse, certainly, or even cruelty towards animals. Older people seem to be forgotten, and yet we're an ageing population. But for older people experiencing abuse, there are lots of reasons. There's a generation that don't want to bother the police. There's also often older people are reliant on their abusers, whether they're carers, paid carers, or their family members who will threaten that they'll put them in a home or they won't see the grandchildren if they tell anybody about what they're experiencing.
What can you do? Where do you come in with this, I guess, for those who are being abused, but also, what's the message here to the abuser? I mean, obviously don't do it, but what help is out there?
Well, I mean, we provide support, as do other voluntary organisations, to older people experiencing abuse. But what's interesting about this case and that Simon Hayes, the sentence that he got, one of the things that we campaign for is tougher sanctions for perpetrators, because that will lead to a deterrent. Now, your report talked about the fact that in the States, Mr. Curry's son is facing charges of elder abuse. We don't have the same legislation. So Simon Hayes was only prosecuted on fraud and perverting the course of justice. But if we had that legislation in this country, then those tougher sentences, mandatory sentences, would show that this kind of abuse is unacceptable in society, and that as a society we will make sure that the offenders stop what they're doing and are punished appropriately.
Rachael, thank you very much for this morning. Rachael Nicholson-Wright, their Director of Action on Elder Abuse. It's 8:14. Claire Carter at breakfast.